right, as she mentioned, my name's Jonathan Curtis. I'm with MetricStream. I'm going to go ahead and see. Let's get comfortable. You've probably heard this whole idea about interconnected, integrated risks many times yesterday and again today. And it's not just isolated to enterprise risk or third-party risk. This extends into ESG, and not only your company's ESG, to every part of all of your third parties in environmental and social risk profile. So I don't know how many, I presume a lot of you saw Rasmussen's talk earlier today, but after that, I don't know which emotion is overwhelming me more, whether it's fear or despair about just the overwhelming volume of current and proposed litigation or legislation. It could be litigation, the legislation revolving around ESG. So we're going to dig deep into that. Unfortunately for me, I've got two enterprise risk professionals here to talk me down, and I want them to introduce themselves, Rodney Campbell and Sanjeev Sharma. Rodney, why don't you go first and give a quick introduction?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rodney Campbell, Head of Third-Party Risk Management at Valley National Bank.
Sanjeev?
Sanjeev Sharma. I work for Wolfspeed. We are silicon carbide company for electric cars, chips, semiconductor chips. And I am the Chief Audit Executive for the company looking after ERM, SOX, and internal audit. So in my past jobs, I've done first line, second line, and third line. So I have all the three experiences around that. So,
all right, well, welcome, guys. So I'm stepping in for a colleague that had a family emergency and couldn't be here. And I didn't have a chance to get to know these guys in advance. And so what I thought I'd do today is just to break the ice and kind of get the conversation going. I'm going to start off with a question that I want both of you to answer. And you feel free to play off of that. But I want to stick on this topic of the integrated risk and the interconnection. And what I want to understand is from both of your perspectives, and I know you've got different experiences, different backgrounds, different impressions, maybe different opinions about this as well. So really kind of coming back to that idea, I want to understand a little bit about, the current integrated idea in terms of context of enterprise risk and third party, and then how that's evolved to where we are. How did we get to where we are today? And then we'll jump off into the ESG from there. Rodney, you want to go first?
Yes, I'll start when I think about interconnectivity, I think about the disconnect that existed for many years between functions. So risk functions within your organization, you may have a third-party risk function, a operational risk function, credit risk function, but none of the departments talk. They both aggregate data, but the data is disconnected. So you have a disconnect between people, technology, and process, which prevents you from having a holistic or a comprehensive risk management framework or culture within your organization.
yeah, that's an excellent point. So enterprise risk management as a concept was evolved by COSO many years back to integrate all the risks. But unfortunately or fortunately, the integration was never achieved by most of the corporations. So that's when you talk about each function, whosoever was very strong in their areas, could promote their areas of risk. And you could see pockets of strengths in companies like banks have pretty good, strong on cybersecurity. The European companies have data privacy, third parties in pockets. We talk about business continuity or talk about ABAC or anti-bribery risks and all. They were very popular for many years, but there's really not much of integration for most of the companies in a way. So that's an excellent initiative if we could move towards that direction.
Got it. Okay, so that's a good start. So now I want to kind of, throw into the mix ESG, and this really kind of complicates things. And every organization, to some extent or another, is subject to this. Some, to a great extent, and certainly with this impending legislation, and those that are, dealing with European operations, subject to, some of the things that we were discussing earlier. When we talk about ESG, really, what are some of the things that you're experiencing and some of the things that you're seeing for how to incorporate that in and take that and integrate it with what you're already doing with your enterprise programs, with the third-party programs, especially the third-party programs? Sanjeev, you want to jump off?
Yeah, so I don't know how many people are aware of this. ESG is not new. 20 years back, UN gave out a report, Who Cares Wins. And that's where, since the last 20 years, ESG has evolved from a simple corporate social responsibility initiative to the highest level, and the CEOs are getting attention. And not only CEOs, is becoming a $1 trillion initiative. Fund managers are talking about it, and you talk about to PwC or any big four, Deloitte reports. This, they consider that as the biggest initiative for revenue generation. So it has become very critical importance. Now, to answer your question, why ESG has become important from the third party perspective, because as we have seen in the last few days, third party is the organizations are no more their own enterprise, is becoming an extended enterprise. When they work with the third parties, ESG is a critical risk for all those third parties, and that's where the biggest challenge. So third party risk and ESG risk have to be combined together to see that how do we address critical areas of ESG. ESG is not alone in your own company.
And just to add to that, the risk of ESG and the impacts have always existed. I think with heightened awareness from regulators, organizations are now being held more accountable for the business they conduct with third parties or service providers. I think in the past it was easy to sign a contract and get your product or service as expected or not as expected and carry on. But now there's a heightened level of awareness. I think delineating roles and responsibilities throughout these life cycle activities, who's accountable for establishing these relationships, monitoring and managing these relationships are more important. So not just financial institutions, but non-financial institutions are aware that they have a bigger social organizational responsibility when these relationships are established.
So Rasmussen mentioned this in his talk earlier. I keep coming back to him because it got my mind racing on so many things. But he had mentioned that, ESG is not so much a risk management protocol or activity in itself, that its goal, whether that goal is, reducing carbon, but that there's, risk with regard to, commitments that you might make with regard to those goals, or risks that you might have with regard to non-compliance with some of this legislation that I'm so afraid of. In that context, are there any kind of guidelines or other things that you might recommend, things that you're seeing in your organizations?
Well, I'll just add just your general due diligence and code of conduct. So aside from the legal or legislative element of it, I think just going back to people, it's really important. You should be critically aware, involved, and engaged as to who you do business with. So you receive a product or service from an organization, it should be your business and commitment to want to know where those product or services or how they're being produced, who's producing those product or services. I think that's critically important. Otherwise, you just get a product or service and have no idea where it's being produced or who's producing it, which will have larger implication for your organization later on down the line.
Yeah, I would say, I would add to this is that ESG has been always in the picture, as you said before. E part of it and G part of it, most of the corporations are very well averse and aware of that. But S part of it is unknown. And there's not consistency. I think as one of the speakers also said before, there's S part is standards of S are different in different continents. And that's where, but we do have defined frameworks. Unfortunately, fortunately, US has most of the areas of proposals are still voluntary, and we are not having enough mandatory requirements. SEC has come out with some proposal recently. The EU is far ahead, and EU has come out with several voluntary and mandatory requirements, and more to come. So I think to Ronnie's point, we need to get from the E part of it is related to environment, and environmental has always been regulated, whether it's OSHA or it is local state regulations in US or in different, every country has its own environmental laws. So we need to definitely be aware of that. So biggest challenge will be to how to address non-regulated part. And so which framework do you adopt? Which areas of voluntary things you adopt?
So that brings up a good question, and I hope I don't throw you under the bus here. But This was mentioned in one of the talks earlier from the S part of ESG, that you give the example, or the example was given of Target or of Anheuser-Busch, where corporate advocacy ended up alienating, everybody, it seems like. And so obviously, there are no standards governing that. Do you have any insights on where companies may go or how far to go? Do you do nothing? Do you stay on the sidelines, or you're focused on corporate profit, or you do you advocate positions?
Yeah, ESG is not going to be just managed by legislations. I think it's ESG is a state of mind. ESG is where the company wants to be. How does the company want to project itself to be? And that's where it becoming more of a CEO's agenda, not an agenda of a regulatory manager of environmental manager, not an EHS manager. So ESG is no more EHS.
Right.
So ESG is more CEO level. So corporates have to define their goals. They have to define their goals of diversity. They have to go define the goals of governance. They have to define their objectives and focus on those. There will be regulations. There will be some more mandatory things come up, but still the corporates can, who will excel will be that who are able to present themselves better than others.
Got it.
I also add that your organizational goals, your strategy, and your purpose of your organization in general, it needs to be more than just words on your landing page. I think when we think about ESG, we always talk about requirements, but requirements don't exist. We're talking about requirements of tomorrow, but what about the risk of today? So you have an organizational strategy, you have words that represent your organization, your company, the people of your company. I think it's important that you walk in that talk. So I can tell you that the awareness now of CEOs, CFOs, everyone at the top of the house, even boards, I think that it's a level of heightened awareness for everyone. Just make sure that your company brand, your organizational message, your strategy is something that you're sticking to.
Right. So enhancing your reputation is a key goal, but actually focusing in on, stakeholder trust and looking at, obviously the basics of, increased market competitiveness and awareness, as key goals. And are there any recommendations you can give to our audience today in terms of, where that balance is when you talk about integrated risk management in the context of, all of what we've been talking about over the last couple of days?
I'll say connect the dots between your internal business teams and your functions, because we're talking about risk, but let's talk about the interconnected risks. How do you identify those risks? How do you assess? How do you manage and monitor those risks? I think it starts with the people. I think we talk about all the data that we're collecting. We use a lot of tools within our organizations. I think you have different business functions within your organization that use the best tools on the market, but none of them are talking or communicating with one another. I think that's a waste of a tool. I think that you can't have a holistic or comprehensive picture of a risk management framework. You can have these individual, independent buckets or siloed worlds of risk, whatever department that you're in. But if they're not mapping, then that doesn't make sense holistically for your organization. It only makes sense for your business unit. But that information you collect in your department and your function that's disconnected from other functions within your organization may have larger implications down the line. So just connect the dots between your people and your functions.
I would add to it same thing. I 100% agree with you, Ronnie. I think the key thing is we have different companies have different softwares and they don't talk to each other. We end up compiling the whole thing in an Excel spreadsheet to give to the CEO that in the dashboard. It is not coming out in a dashboard kind of real time and data information. I think that's a step to move towards. And the key is we use more technology and use more coordination and let's have functions speak to each other. So that's where the biggest difference is.
So these are great approaches in terms of ensuring that this integrated approach is in place, and we understand it's a journey and that things, aren't, there's no magic wand here. But are there any, following up on Gavin and Grace's presentation about quantitative, are there any KPIs or are there any other things that we can bring to bear to make sure that we're in alignment on this, or anything, I'm trying to go back to the S part of this again too, which seems to be the harder part of all this, but anything from your perspective that, might guide us in terms of how we can measure our performance?
Yeah, so what we have done in our company is that we identified top 20 risks across the company as part of ERM process. And within that ERM process, what we have done is that each of the risk owners have been identified that, okay, these are the areas you're looking at, and you look at your process, people, and technology, and identify what areas of gaps do you have, and define those KRIs and KPIs. ERM professionals cannot provide that, okay, use those KRIs. These KRIs have to come from the respective risk owners. So that way, it is not driven by the ERM team. It is more driven by respective businesses. So I think I think the mantra for success is that ERM professionals should provide the tools, facilitate them, but not guide them to the extent that they say, okay, stay away from us. They should lead the effort.
Got it. Rodney, any insights?
Yeah, I'll just go back to just delineating the roles and responsibilities is so important. We have first, second line of defense, but I think that if you are the owner of a relationship, it's important that the competency levels are established. So we assign relationships to relationship managers or business owners unknowingly that the individual doesn't have any knowledge of the relationship that they're managing. So they're at a default from day one. You can't manage a contractual relationship or a vendor relationship if you have no understanding of what the relationship entails. So if all you know is what it does for you, the vendor, product or service is a business, you don't know anything else, you don't know what sustains it, what supports it, or what's required to sustain or support it, then how can you establish any effective KPIs or KRIs? You can't have any real true governance. So you need to make sure that it's a collaborative effort, not just first line of defense business owners, because they manage the day-to-day transactional relationship with third parties, but your risk functions need to be involved because your KPIs, your KRIs, all that information is memorialized in your contract. So you need to make sure that everyone who should be involved is involved at the beginning. And that's when you have a good internal alignment and governance structure from day one.
So you guys have relieved some of my anxiety and fear with regard to ESG and this impending doom I was feeling after Rasmussen's comments. But we've only got a couple minutes left. Is there any final comments or advice or recommendations you might give to our audience today?
I think we said a lot, but interconnectivity is incredibly important. We talk about the risk culture of our organizations. I think the collaborative model is critically important. I think sometimes we work within an organization, but we also operate like separate companies. So the competitive edge that we have prevents us from collaborating. That competitive edge has established silos, which played or grew into larger implications for our organization. So we need to have a shared common goal. We need to understand what that goal is and make sure that in that collaborative model, we're doing the right thing for our organizations.
I would say to add to it, the three things I always consider for success of, I think everybody has talked about that in the last 2 days. Tone at the top. Okay. That is the key thing, but to start with. So any integration of review of risk will not work unless you get a tone at the top. Yes, management wants to do it. Senior leadership wants to do it. Once you have it, the second thing is, as Ronnie said, definition of roles and responsibilities are key. The third one is they need to put up a structure around for integration. And the fourth thing is technology. We use right technology. And the fifth thing is very critical: training, awareness, and monitoring of what we have say do. I'm a great believer of say do. I think I heard some of the people here say that federal programs don't work for 85% of the cases, right? It's because we don't do much say do. In corporate world also same thing. So we need to have good monitoring process also.
Good. Well, thank you. So it looks like we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to throw you guys under the bus one more time here. So I don't know if we've got questions from the audience for our panelists, but since we do have a couple of minutes, I'm going to give you that opportunity and open it up. And we'll do our best. Yes.
So, well, I won't say audit because I was going to say audit at first. It's being third line of defense, so I'll leave that out. That always happens. So there's always a struggle into what we identify in our relationships, not just ESG, but all other types of categories of risk. But ESG in particular, staying on the topic of, I myself have experienced that with first line of defense. I think that those discussions don't end overnight. I think it's about our due diligence. It's the level of input that we have internally. So you want to make sure that the right people are a part of the discussion, because what I've seen happen in many organizations, decisions are made with half or no information or missing information. So this is why it gets back down to the competency level. Who is actually evaluating, performing the due diligence? Oftentimes what I discover is this back and forth of, I don't agree, I disagree, this doesn't make sense, this does make sense, or this is what I mean. It often comes down to their interpretation or misinterpretation of what they're reviewing or what they're analyzing. So I do think organizations need to be very clear. When you have individuals who identify risk, you have individuals who perform due diligence, you're collecting data to reduce and mitigate risk. You have individuals who are assessing it thereafter. Make sure that they're not just aware of the climate, they're ahead of the times, but they know exactly what they're doing. I think that knowledge base, that competency, feeds for a more fruitful or productive discussion between the two lines of defense. That helped me actually.
I would say that first line of defense has to own the key ownership, right? They are the key owners of the whole process. Second line could be more staff function, probably from the talking about wherever they could be considered as more guiding part of it, and wherever the first line is not able to do, or making sure that first line does what is required to be done. And to be honest, there's a very thin line between the two. In many cases, you have to work as more collaborative effort. You cannot work as us versus them, especially in area which is everyone in the industry is struggling to put their lay hands on. So you cannot say, okay, this is just purely the definition. You can't have them fail and then come out, okay, first you fail and then we come back, that you have failed now. Right? So to me, the third line also cannot stay away. And unfortunately, internal auditors try to do it like we will act as, I heard some of the people say that we are more sheriffs and all, right? You cannot act as sheriff in these cases. This is a perfect opportunity to build up an advisory role, to build up the ESG structure in the company. And of course, there has to be an objectivity involved. I personally see that ESG will become as strong as required as from framework perspective as SOX. So I don't know, you've seen that. We talk about internal control over financial reporting. COSO has come out with the internal controls over sustainability reporting. So ICSR, that's the new concept. So you cannot internal auditors cannot be staying away from this anymore. They have to get into very soon.
All right, well, Rodney, Sanjeev, thanks for coming up on stage with me today. That's all of our time. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.